Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming to this book talk tonight. We're going to be talking with two authors. We have Ira, who is the author of a few books, but the most recent one is This Jade World. Um, Ira is the author of 5 books in total, including Buddha's Dog and Other Meditations. And he's also an American Book Award winner and the president of Sweet, a literary confection, which is on sweetlit.com. I'll share a link to that one too. And talking with Ira, we have our a special honor to Sana because House Number 12, Block Number 3 is Sana's debut novel, which has already been shortlisted for Indie's Best. So keep an eye out for that, which is really fun. Sana grew up in Pakistan and has a degree in English and literature and is currently pursuing her master's in creative writing at the University of Cambridge. Yeah, so let's hop into the talk and then everybody start thinking about questions. I know I have a few.
Thank you, Sayan, for the introduction. And thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you, Chavalier Books, for hosting this event. Like Sayan said, I'm Ira Sukrungruang, and I'm coming to you all from Columbus, Ohio. And because it's 8 o'clock here, there is like a tiny little chance that my 5-year-old might be going streaking by during this reading, which he has done a number of times during this pandemic, right? Because this is right about his bedtime and bath time, so that might happen. I always think it's an adventure. I think we're all kind of like used to, in many ways, like the oddities of Zoom readings and the endearments of Zoom readings, like cats trying to eat your food and whatnot. I am so honored to be in conversation today with today's featured author, Sana Balagamwala. Her debut novel, House Number 12, Block Number 3, is quite phenomenal. In my classes, I often tell my students, and they're all smarty pants, English lit and creative writing students, for their reader reactions of the book, like not a deeper meaning, not reading that it explores a theory or philosophy, but a reaction that made them know that they wanted to be in a literary life, like wanted to pursue a career as an English student, wanted to pursue a career as perhaps a creative writer. I want them to say what they felt, joy, sadness, anger, that they felt something, right? I think we live in this culture that sometimes feels like we aren't able to talk about what we feel. And my reader reaction when I read Sana's book was one of awe, of the scope and range and the weaving and interweaving of the historical and family tensions of this book. I felt grief, the grief of loss, but also, and if you make your way through this book, you're going to also feel like this wonderful flight of hope and joy too. I think which is such a powerful thing. So what's going to happen today is we're going to have a little conversation about the writing of the book, and then we'll open up questions to you all as audience members. But before we even start, I would love, Sana, if you can just like sampling of the book.
Thank you, Ira, for that very nice introduction. I appreciate it so much. And thank you to Chevaliers and Sayan for hosting us. I'll start with a reading. I'm going to read from chapter 1. Okay, I'll just get on it. Nadia is sitting up in bed, her back against the low wooden headboard, her head buried in her lap. Her hair is uncombed and matted. Even though it is not cold, she shivers under a thick woolen blanket that Zainab has draped around her. At intervals, she exhales, hollow, empty gasps. Appa goes to her. She has seen this before. We have all seen this before. Salam, beta, she says. Nadia digs her thumbnail into her cuticles and picks at the raw skin. A tremor convulses through her body. Appa sits down next to her and takes her hand, squeezing it tight to stop it from trembling. She strokes her head gently. It's all right, she says. You're all right. The elderly woman retrieves an assortment of objects from her bag and lays them on the bedside table. A packet of herbs, a 2-inch rectangular strip of paper, a black square cloth, and some string. On the strip of paper, she transcribes a prayer for wellness in precise Arabic script. She folds it into a square, 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch. She wraps the paper with the cloth and secures it with string, as though wrapping a miniature gift. She gives the amulet to the young girl who is still trembling. "Put it under your pillow," she says. Nadia glances up. She has her mother's eyes, green with glints of gray. When Nadia was born and opened her eyes to the world for the first time, the nurses had marveled. Among a sea of babies with dark eyes, her eyes were 1 in 1,000. She's won the genetic lottery, the nurse had remarked. Prayers were said and 2 goats had been sacrificed to protect her from Nazar, evil eye. Now Nadia's eyes are vacuous and her hair is thinning. Clumps lay on her pillow as though someone comes and pulls it out in the night while she sleeps. "I don't want to see him," Nadia says softly. She has run out of tears, but sorrow has not had its fill. There are dark caverns between her eyes, and her cheeks are sunken like caves. "I cannot bear to see her like this. A 20-year-old needs to be vibrant and delirious at the promise of life. She should not be like this, not like an old spinster, broken and bearing the burdens of the world." "There is no one here," Zainab says to her daughter. "It's just me and Appa. You had a nightmare, again." I don't know if Nadia hears her mother, but her eyes dart around the room like an injured rabbit hiding from a wolf. "You're okay," Appa speaks softly. "You don't have to see anyone." To Zainab, Appa says, "Bring warm water. I'll make her some tea. It will help her anxiety." Zainab withdraws from the room and returns with a mug of warm water. Appa drops a packet of herbs in it and stirs vigorously. Some particles dissolve. The big bits and leaves dance about on the surface. "Here, take a sip," Appa says. Nadia drinks. "Some more, beta, at least half," Appa prompts. Zainab turns on the wall sconce. The yellow gleam divulges the disarray in Nadia's room. It has been a few weeks since it has been cleaned. She won't let anyone in since her father has passed away. The desk in the corner by the window is stacked with books and school coursework, overdue, forgotten. Behind the books, slightly visible, are scribbles on the wall. When she is alone, Nadia makes notes in notebooks and sometimes on the wall. The light reveals the worry lines that dart across the young girl's forehead. Nadia winces in discomfort, as though the light will betray her secret, and covers her face with a blanket. "It is too much for me," she says. The light. Zainab flicks the switch off, and again we are left in the dark. Appa talks to Nadia and reads out prayers. An hour passes, and I see the angst that simmers in the young girl's eyes begin to subside. Perhaps it is prayer that soothes her. Perhaps it is Appa's presence. Nadia closes her eyes and drifts into sleep. Zainab and Appa talk in hushed voices while Nadia sleeps. They discuss the possibility of the jinn possessing her body. Why else would she be this way, Zainab wonders? Why else would she waver between sanity and madness, break into anxious fits of fear and tears with no reason, refuse to leave her room or meet with anyone? I think too sometimes that a jinn has taken over the girl, but I know things that Zainab doesn't, and her ignorance is a burden I must bear. Daylight dissipates the early morning darkness, and the streets begin to come back to life. Neighbors out for a brisk morning walk to ward off cardiovascular disease. Chowkidars perch outside gates on rattan stools, drinking their morning tea. And Mrs. Khalid next door buying okra. They all pretend to go about their day and not to notice, but they see Appa leaving. They've seen her come and go before, and they know that Appa visits us at house number 12 on block number 3 because Nadia has gone mad.
Wow, thank you so much for that. It's stunning. I mean, I keep coming back to Nadia as a character, especially right from the beginning of the book, and I always talk to my students about like going to the body, write about the body, and every time Nadia comes and the way her madness is displayed by her anxiousness, her picking at, her fingers, and the pacing is just, it's haunting. It's really haunting. So one of the things that like immediately from like the first chapter that you read there, that I was immediately gripped by was the use of the first person pronoun of the I. And maybe this is because because I'm primarily a nonfiction writer and I love the pronoun I. Perhaps it's like this narcissistic part of me, but the novel employs the I in such a unique way, right? And this is not a spoiler for anyone because it's right in the beginning of the book. But the voice telling the story is not a person, right? It's the house itself, right? And so, like, for me as a writer, I'm so curious about how you came to that decision. Was it immediate, or was it something that you kind of fell into, and what were you hoping like this house would say or tell?
Okay, that's a good question. So I've always felt that we as humans we have such a special relationship with the places that shelter us, and the places we call home and the places we grow up in, and I feel they have such an impact on who we become. So that was kind of the original thought in my mind as I started writing from the perspective of a house and my own home. I grew up in one home for my whole life, and that home was such an important character in my life, and I always felt so connected to it. And so, what I wanted to do was sort of have this omniscient narrator who knows everything, and yet is very powerless. And so, the house sees what's happening; it feels for the characters who it shelters, and yet it's unable to do anything to help them. And I wanted to create this feeling of powerlessness because I think as human beings, we often feel that way in our lives. We can see something that's happening and we're just powerless to do anything about it. So by using the home as the narrator and as a character in the book, I wanted to kind of tap into that feeling of omniscience, but also powerlessness.
It also, I mean, I think too, like it also is a reflection of like the sense of powerlessness that is in that family, like especially when looking at and dealing with Nadia and what she's going through. And to me, like one of the beautiful things about this on two levels is that the house to me is almost like the teller of the secrets. Like it's telling the secrets of what is happening in this family to this character, the world outside of the house itself too. And I don't know, and this is something I wanted to kind of talk about a little later, in terms of issues of mental health. But there's this sense of like closed inness. Like the house is an intimate structure, but it also at times felt, as a claustrophobic, like, the walls that we've built up and can only stay within too. Did you think, well, that's something that you thought about in terms of like crafting, the voice of this house, but also like thinking about like how the structure itself closes in on the characters in this family, especially Nadia?
So I think when I feel like I do better when I write within a restriction. So when I placed a restriction of the house, there were certain biases that would come in, and there were certain things that the house is not able to see what happens on the next street. So, it hears it on the radio or it hears it on the television. The house can see a little bit of the neighbor and what happens in the neighbor's house. So I felt like working within that restriction made for a fun process just in writing. So I think that was part of it. And then also, I felt like the house deals, this novel is a lot about memory. And by making the house and certain things in the house almost alive, I felt like it kind of honored memory, because like when we think back on our childhood, sometimes we'll think back on the yellow teacup with the flower that your mom drank her tea from, or the lace curtain in your grandma's house, or like that coffee table which was just a little bit chipped on the corner. I think those are the things that sort of anchor our memories. And so I wanted to anchor the memories in this house through the little detail in the home and make it almost alive. So did I answer your question?
Oh,
I feel like
absolutely,
I went
absolutely.
off a little.
No. I think you answered that completely beautifully, and I always think about this too, especially in the idea of this book, because we begin with, you know, a death, right? And so in many ways, like, you know, we are also looking at the spaces someone used to fill, right? In that empty. And I love how you said, like, how when we look at like a teacup, or how we look at certain items, we yes, we see the items, but we see a story, right? We see the person that's connected to that. Absolutely. So one of the other things that I'm so, just drawn to in this piece is the scope of the novel itself. The usage of time, it's very epic, right? Like we have large, like swaths of time that we're going. It kind of reminds me, I just was reading Pachinko by Minji Lee, and looking at like how she's handling like these 4 generations of this family in Korean family in Japan. This has that same feel, because the book starts contemporary, like closer to the contemporary timeline of this book, 1981, right? Though I think the last chapter and near the end is 1988, but like the true beginning of it is 1957, right? When Zainab and Haji like begin their lives in the house, right? So I was curious about how you saw, for example, the evolution of place, and also the evolution of this particular family as you were writing this book.
So it's funny that you bring up Pachinko, because when I read that, I just said to myself, I wish I could have written this much like this, because the scope of that novel is so beautiful. So I think when I started, I thought it would be a longer novel, and I think I just don't have the stamina to write a long novel. So then I condensed it. But I think the way this novel started was me collecting stories from my childhood, and even before I was born, the 60s and the 70s, when it was a very turbulent time historically in Pakistan and Pakistani politics. So I remember my parents and my grandparents would talk about the wars in passing. It was such an important part of just the narrative in our house. Oh, remember when, blah, blah went to East Pakistan, because that's when it was called, and then didn't come back and disappeared. It was such a important part of the conversations in our families. Or remember when Bhutto was assassinated, and remember when Ziala came. Like, these were just conversations that were always happening in our home. And the novel started as me wanting to kind of collect all these memories and kind of write them down for myself. So as I started writing them down, I realized that there was a lot of bias, of course, in all the stories that I was hearing. So that's when I started researching and reading a lot about the histories of Pakistan, of India, and of Bangladesh, because they were so interconnected. And so I did a lot of research. And it's just fascinating. And a lot of the things we learned in school, because of course, history is taught in very biased ways. A lot of the things we learned in school, there were so many gaps, and a lot of things were whitewashed. So as I read, and the nice thing about just the internet and access to so much more information now is you can read multiple perspectives. So as I read and as I collected the stories, I was just fascinated at how much deeper everything went. So I started with a lot of research, oral history, conversations with the generation who did take part in the partition, who did take part in the War of 1971, who did take part in the War of 1965. So just putting all their stories together. And then, of course, the characters are all fictional, the main characters. So kind of using the actual history as a skeleton and kind of like pillars, and then filling it in with fictional characters and their biases, their stories. So I sort of, that's how I went about it. And I learned so much during this process, and I felt it was such a personal project for that reason, because I learned a lot about the history of my own past and my own family while doing this.
And that's, I mean, this that's a perfect kind of segue into like my next question, because the book so heavily relies on history and political turmoil of place. And I've worked with so many graduate students and writers who are trying to write historical fiction that really that they have an emotional stake from, like they're trying to preserve, say, like their Cuban heritage and stuff like that. And so my question though, and you said you had done heavy research, where does that balance lie for you as a writer? Like when is a book, when are you thinking like, okay, I have to be historical, I have to have historical fidelity, um, but then I also have to lose myself in that loveliness that is the myth making or the story making of fiction writing? Like, where do you say, okay, you know what, here's the fact, but you know what, I'm going to stray away from this. I'm going to I'm going to make things up. I'm going to challenge history or challenge the fact of history.
Mhm. Well, that's a tricky question. Well, as far as the dates go, I kept those pretty much on point. I didn't change the dates. In fact, I had to change my story narrative a little bit because it didn't fit in the dates. So like, for example, there was a women's protest in 1983. And in the original story, it didn't fit in because Nadia would have been like 5, and I wanted her to be older so she could have taken part in the protest. So I had to change the character's life a little bit to fit in the historical events that I wanted to bring into the story. And then I guess I just left out some events too, which weren't fitting. But as long as I try to keep all the dates the same, like the partition, the wars, the big dates, the death of certain historical characters, those things I tried to keep the same. And then again, that was a restriction. And then I kind of wove the fictional narrative through it, just around it. Does that make sense?
No, absolutely. And I love how, you're utilizing like these words, and you had said it before when we were talking about POV, but utilizing like these words as restrictions, as a positivity in terms of the writing, right? Like in terms of it pushes you into, say, areas you wouldn't usually go to, right? Because of, say, the truth of the matter or the truth of the character or the story of the character. And I think one of the other things that's really interesting too is that history timeline is one thing, but like story timeline is a completely different thing, right? And
Yeah.
one of the things it's one of the things that I find really beautiful about this is that they're being woven in just really quite beautifully here. So I am right now staying with my mom. My mom is 86 years old. I picked her up from Thailand, and she came back with me. And one of the things, we're talking a lot because we haven't seen each other in 3 years, and we talk a lot about mental health, actually. I keep telling her, like, maybe this is TMI for the readers, but I go see a therapist. She's like, why do you need to go see a therapist? Like, why can't you just like, figure stuff out yourself, right? And so one of the things about your book really tackles this issue of like mental health, right? I think one of the things that I'm drawn to, I think it's so complicated culturally how mental health is viewed in this book, but I also think during that time period in particular too, right? We have structures that did not exist when we talk about mental health, when we talk about madness. So one of the things I was thinking about, when I was reading this book was, how did you navigate this world and tackle this issue of something very serious, especially in the character of Nadia, right? And the secrets, right, trying to withhold. Like, what were some of the difficulties of writing, a character who's suffering in such a way?
So I think what was difficult is to get a balance to make her character feel authentic, because I didn't want to make it seem overdone, but I also wanted to be respectful and authentic because there's so many different ways that mental illness shows up and trauma shows up and anxiety shows up. There's no one particular way. So I just wanted to make sure that I was being as authentic as possible, and not yeah, and being respectful to the to anyone who suffers from anxiety or any mental health. So I did a lot of reading and research and talking to um, people who suffered from mental health. So just to kind of make my work feel authentic. And I think the period that Nadia is growing up in, so it's the 60s to the 80s, that's where it's taking place. And I think in talking to Pakistani men and women who grew up during that time period, it was not something that was even, it was barely ever touched upon. Like, so you could be suffering from depression or anxiety, but often it was just seen as, oh, you just need to get over it, or you've been, possessed by a jinn. That was a very common thing. And not to say that that might not be true. It could be true. Maybe maybe that did happen, but it was just an easy thing to say, oh, you've been taken over by a jinn, or something is affecting you, and you'll be fine. You need to do this, or maybe you need to pray. And not that there's anything wrong with prayer, but prayer in conjunction with something else is often needed when you're dealing with depression or anxiety. And I think in South Asian cultures, that was something that's always been so taboo, to have anxiety or depression, even those words, to use them on someone, or to have a disorder. It's almost like sorry, phone ringing. So it's almost like an illness that like the flu is fine, even cancer is fine, because it's kind of not your fault. But I feel like mental illness becomes almost the person who suffers from it. It becomes their fault, or something they've done wrong. And even if you and getting help is almost a form of weakness, and it's also something you'll never get over. So you can get over the flu, but the depression or the anxiety, or it's always like a blemish on your character almost. So you always have to be wary. Well, this person, they used to have something wrong with them, so you never know how they are now. And I think that's such a difficult, it's so difficult, because you can't get help when you can't even accept that you have something that needs help. So I feel like South Asian cultures, I think in this generation, I feel with my children and with me, I think it's much better, but still we have such a long way to come, because it's still considered like, okay, fine, we understand, you can see a therapist, okay, I guess, but really, why don't you just pray a little more? Or why don't you just go for a walk? Or, why don't you get married and have a few kids?
Oh, wow. Yeah, no, I love that. Why don't you get married? Why don't you go for a walk? I think
yeah, and they all can help. All these things can help you, but it may not get rid of, you still need something bigger.
Absolutely. Well, and I think you brought up something with the idea of marriage, right? In particular, like, because the madness in this book is so centered around Nadia, right? And also like her mother and that protective gay, like, how does gender complicate this, issue of gender complicate this for in the novel, or even just in that larger sense of the world that these characters exist in?
Oh, gender, I think it's just adds another layer. In one way, I feel like, as a male, maybe you can share with me from like maybe Thai culture or other Asian cultures, but in South Asian cultures, like the man, I think it's even harder for a man to go and ask for therapy, or to admit that he needs help, or he's struggling with mental health. I think for men, it's much harder than, I feel like with women, it's sort of accepted. Okay, you need a little help. You're going through a lot emotionally, because by nature, women are, supposed to be more emotional maybe. But I think for a man, it would be even harder to, because you just gotta, like shake it off, be a man, like all those kinds of things that you just grew up hearing, like don't cry about it, be a big boy, don't be a baby. So I feel it's harder for men, I feel, to get mental health support. But also for women, I don't know. Does that make sense? Do you feel like for men, it's just considered something that they shouldn't struggle with?
Oh, you do. I do. I think there's that that sense of like playing into these roles of masculinity or false masculinity that you just need to definitely, you know, just toughen up, right? Or, you know, deal with it. But, you know, one of the things that I do think that's interesting, though, from like beyond just a person who's experiencing, you know, the ailment or suffering from the ailment, is the people that surround them, right? Like, and so like in this book, there's this sense of like shame, or there's a sense of trying to keep secret, or trying to, like, so we started this book talking about like how the walls of this house really could seem very claustrophobic at times, right? As a way to keep something in. And in many ways, it was keeping in this secret, like, you know, and looking at, say, mom trying to like, okay, let's just, you know, we'll figure something out, right? That's something that was so kind of looked at too, in terms of like, okay, where is the ally here? Why, you know, there's the absence of you know, need, and that's because it's predicated by, of course, the time period and the historical turmoil and all that stuff the family was going through anyways. But to me, I was thinking about, wow, okay, this secret, this thing that we don't want to tell, we don't want to be let out, right? Is the thing that I don't think, if, you know, it's what our culture fears also, honestly,
No,
right?
for sure, for sure. It's a lot about don't share too much, because people never forget. They'll, you know, they'll always remember that illness that you once had, and they'll never look at you the same way, or your damaged goods in some way. And going back to what you said about the house feeling restrictive, you know, I feel like in South Asian cultures, gender roles are very restrictive. Like,
Oh, absolutely.
you know, I mean, like a cisgender, like, you know, you're male, you're female. It's, you have to be very specific in both of those. And then, I mean, you're transgender, so that's a whole other sort of separate kind of, you kind of keep to yourself. So you don't mix with the rest of the community. It's just so the gender roles are so restrictive. And I think that's so problematic in itself, right? So I'm glad that you, I mean, not that my book directly deals with that, but I mean, to a great extent it does, because you see how specific Nadia is supposed to act, how she's supposed to behave. You know, she's getting the ability to go to school, but then please don't talk too much, don't try to study these subjects, but still also get married. You know, you can have freedom, but not too much, you know, just kind of walk in that lane. Don't try to get out of your lane. So there's a lot on her as a young woman growing up.
Absolutely. No, I completely agree with that. I think, you know, I think it's in your book, it does play that, because when we talk about these issues of mental health, and we talk about these issues of gender as it relates to mental health, we're also talking about issues of power and powerlessness, right? And I think that's one of the big, you know, if you look at your book, we have this struggle that's outside the home politically, between power and the powerless, those who have and those who want, right? And then that one of the things about the book is that you have that outer world, and then we begin to close that in, and the issues that are within that family, within that house, is still operating on this issue of power and powerlessness, who has voice, who has agency, and who doesn't, right? Which is, I think, one of the big kind of appeals and pulls of your novel. So I would love to hear questions from the audience, and see, you know, if any of the audience have anything for you, Sana, to answer.
Thank you, Ira.
I just sent a message about questions, so people might still be like typing them up right now.
Okay.
I guess I have a question, and then if you, Ira, if you want to hop in after that. You mentioned a little bit about the research that you did because of like the time period the book is set in, and also when it comes to like mental health stuff. I was kind of wondering, like, what is the maybe like most interesting or surprising thing that you found during your research for the book?
Oh, that's a very good question. So, Pakistan has been, I mean, since its inception, it got independent in 1947. And when we study the history in school, it's very like, I mean, it's very boring, first of all. how we're taught. And it leaves out a lot of things. So when I was researching, I found that there were a lot of women in politics, women in power in politics who did a lot for the country and for civil rights and for women's rights movements. And I felt when we were taught Pakistani history in our school, it was glossed over. We didn't talk about women writers and poets and women, organizing protests and standing up for civil rights, for human rights. We didn't hear about it at all, as though the women were a very silent kind of, submissive sort of entity. And so I thought it was really interesting that was all left out. And yeah, just a lot of things are just glossed over. For example, transgender rights. In Pakistan, the transgender community is called the Khwaja Sera, and we never learn about that in school, like never, nothing about them. But they have their own history and their struggles. And as I was researching, I was finding out so much about that. And it was really amazing that they're such an important part of the culture of the Indian subcontinent, Pakistan, India. And all of that is kind of just suppressed in history books. So it was really inspiring to find out all those things, and hopefully, something will change, and children growing up will learn about those sorts of shakers and movers in their own history. Thank you for that question.
Thank you for that answer. I feel like it pairs really well too, because even before we see like nonfiction take on a lot of like hidden histories, I feel like we see fiction taken on. So it fits really well.
That's a really good point. Thank you.
There's a question here, I think, from Janelle's. It's a really great question. I think a question that I think most writers should get asked. What about the book or the process of writing it did you feel most proud of?
Oh gosh, Janelle, thank you for coming on and for your question. What do I feel the most proud of? Well, I think this book started as a personal project, and I never knew if it would ever be published. So I guess I'm proud that I actually finished it, because I'm the kind of person, I start a lot of things and then I just kind of drop off in the middle. Once I wanted to start a perfume shop, and I haven't started it at all. So just to give you an example, I have all these ideas. So I think I'm proud that I actually finished something, for better or worse. So yeah, just getting something done. I think that. Thank you though for your question.
Yeah, I'm always about the finishing is such a, people underestimate how hard, right? Like just to finish something. Let's see. Is there another question? I haven't been looking at the Q&A. I just been looking at the chat here. Oh, this is a great question from Rachel. Do you have another book planned for the future? I would love to hear more from you.
Oh, thank you, Rachel, for your question. So I'm in graduate school right now, and that's forcing me to do a little bit of writing. So I've been thinking about a project. I haven't done much on it, but I think the next project would be, there's a book that I really loved. It was The Women of Brewster Place by, gosh, I forgot the author, Gloria Gaynor, I think. And it's just about different stories of different women who live in this one neighborhood in one building. And I thought I was so inspired by that. And my hope is to be able to write a book of immigrant stories based in Los Angeles, where these, from a women's perspective. So these women, they live in a community or close by in Los Angeles, and they've come from different parts of the world, and to kind of tackle their American dream, and them coming in and trying to figure out their life here as women in the US. So I think it'll be like a book of immigrant stories, maybe a novel in stories, but I'm not sure. I've just started thinking about it.
We've got another question here in the Q&A. It says, was it difficult as a woman writing a book about a girl who experienced sexual abuse?
Yeah, it was actually. Yes, thank you for that question. Thank you. It was because I think as a woman, almost every single woman I know has had some kind of assault on her, either verbal or physical. Sometimes it's just a touch, but most of the time it's much more. Um, Almost every woman I've talked to has experienced something like this. And many times in South Asian cultures, it's not talked about directly. It will be kind of hinted at, like, okay, don't go to that part of the, don't go there, or don't hang out with that uncle, or make sure you don't sit on someone's lap. It's just said in a very, you kind of beat around the bush a little bit. So I feel like of course it's happened and we don't talk about it, but it's happened even much more than we realize, and it happens much more than we realize. So I felt like there was all this generational and historical trauma that kind of came through when I was writing about her. And it's a very heartbreaking thing to write about. So yes, it was difficult, but it was also very liberating to write about it, because I hope that it will have people talk about it, and it will have people talk to each other, because I think this sort of stuff shouldn't be swept under the rug. It needs to come up. It needs to be talked about. We need to be aware of it. So in that way, it was liberating. And I was grateful that I got to write her story.
Wonderful. Amen. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. We have a question here from Jasmine. Do you feel like Nadia's story has been told, or do you feel like you have more to say about her life, her struggle, her growth? Are you done with Nadia?
Oh, thank you, Yasmin. Did Yasmin ask that? Is that the question she asked? Thank you for your question. So like I was saying, ideally it would have been like an 800-page novel with different generations, and Nadia would be the link between all of them, but I don't have the stamina to write such a big novel. So I think I'm done with her. I think I'm done with her. Yes. But you never know. You never know.
Yeah, you absolutely never know, right? When you think you're done with something, and then like 10 years, 15 years down the road, they
That's
come
so
back
true. That's so true. So
unexpectedly.
maybe she'll come back and she'll start bothering me, and then I'll have to write something about her.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
We have another question in the Q&A. It just says, when and where is the book success party? Just for like your success. I don't know when the news from Indie's Best is going to come out, so maybe when that news comes out.
In June, like mid-June, I think.
So I want to say that Ira's book was also nominated in the nonfiction category. His book is nominated also for the Indies Award. So we're buddies in that way. I feel very privileged to be with such cool authors.
Well, I think I think that question is where's the party going to be?
Where's
right?
the
Like,
party
where's
at?
the party at? Right? And they're like, you're in LA. Like, come on.
Where's the party at?
Where's the party at?
Okay. We can connect privately and we can plan a party.
Awesome.
Everyone's invited.
Oh, I love it. I love it. One of the things I was really curious about as a person, for me, English is a second language too. And so I was wondering about just the process of writing, right? Because I know that English is a second language for you too, are you a slow writer? Does language come to you differently, right? Like for me, I always say to people who ask this question, it goes through like various filters, like before it finds a shape as a sentence. Like it first starts as sound, because Thai is such a tonal language, right? And then sound becomes image, and image, then gets through another filter, right? So how did English as a secondary language for you affect your process, or do you even notice it now, since you're so probably, accustomed to it?
Oh, that's a good point. I love the part about Thai coming in as sounds first. I think it takes me a while to formulate a sentence, and I think maybe it's because of the language, the translation, because even though we learned English all through elementary school and middle school, I still somehow think in Urdu. and then translate those thoughts to English. And I think that's why I feel like sometimes the right sentence doesn't come out, and it takes a little while for the sentence to feel authentic. Yes, but also I think in this novel, I used Urdu words without translation, because it just felt more real. That's how they came, and I didn't want to look for a translation, a translated word, because sometimes it doesn't give the same meaning. So I felt like that helped me feel more fluent, that I could get my words and thoughts out, because I had the ability to use Urdu words here and there in my book. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's great. We have other questions compiling here. We've got another one from Nadia, who asks, who are your literary inspirations? What authors or books do you find yourself reading over and over again?
So I love Toni Morrison, and she was one of the authors who I read much later in life. I didn't grow up reading her. I read her first as a college student, and I was just blown away. Her and James Baldwin. I just loved them so much in the way they tackled such difficult, raw things with such ease. So those are two big authors who I love. And there's so many, so many authors recently who I've read that are so inspiring. And I love reading poetry too, even though I write terrible poetry, but I think when you read poems, it's just the immediacy of the feeling comes through so quickly. So I think all novel writers, all writers can learn so much from the reading of poetry. And one of my favorite poets as a kid has always been a Lebanese poet called Khalil Gibran. And it's so soothing. Like whenever I read his poetry, I always felt so soothed. And of course, like Wuthering Heights, I'm such a Bronte's girl. Jane Austen, like those women, I grew up reading them and I can reread them over and over. They're just good books to go back to. Thank you for your question.
We have a question from Maria too, asking, well, first a statement, political upheaval has never left the scene in Pakistan. Just from the events from today, you have material to write an entire book. This time, maybe from the perspective of the National Assembly / Parliament, was witnessed unspeakable atrocities and unprecedented triumphs.
Oh, that's so great. Hold on, I'm gonna take a note. Very good, thank you.
There's a question in the chat here by Nuria. I absolutely love the novel. What do you hope readers will take away from the story?
Oh, thank you for your question. I hope that people will use it as a vehicle to talk openly about assault, about mental illness, about childhood sexual abuse, because these things are, especially assault and abuse, are brushed under the rug so often. We beat around the bush, we don't come out and say it. And it's so difficult to come out and say it because it's the victim who gets the blame, it's the victim who gets the shame. So it's such a difficult thing for us to have to go through it and then to have to come out and say it and then deal with the shame. So I hope that our community can have these conversations and create more awareness. I think that's the biggest takeaway. I hope people will just talk about things.
The question that we have in the Q&A, this one kind of relates to what you just said. So I'll say they're also asking about the themes of mental health and sexual abuse, but they're specifically asking how it was perceived during your book tour in Pakistan. Like, were you surprised by the responses at all?
Oh, thank you for your question. So I had a very short, a small book tour in Pakistan because I was there. COVID got really bad, so I had a small book launch. And I think, again, people will talk about, oh, I'm glad you're addressing it, but it's in the private messages that I get. It's like, thank you for bringing this up. Thank you for talking about this. So they come through in the private messages, but I think openly people will say, oh, you bring up good topics, but it doesn't really push the conversation any further. because I think it's still an uncomfortable thing to talk about in a bigger space or in a public space. But I think definitely I've had people reach out and send me a message or on my Instagram, just thank you for writing about this, or this really made me feel seen, or, but I think this is still such a private thing. It's hard to come out and say it. In a group setting, like this happened to me and I want to talk about it. I think it's a very difficult thing to do. Thank you for your question.
I think those, are there any final questions? We've had a lot of good ones.
Yes, sure.
Thank you so much, everyone, for your questions, and thank you, Sana, for the book and the reading, and Xavier. I mean, thanks for hosting, and awesome. This has been such a wonderful night, and I'm so happy my 5-year-old did not come streaking through. But yeah, this is wonderful.
And thank you, Sayan. Thank you for everyone who joined in. And thank you to Chevaliers. I really appreciate your time.
We're getting a lot of thank yous in the chat too. It's been great. Thank you so much, everybody. Look out for the recording on our YouTube. And if you live in the neighborhood, stop by Chevaliers to get a copy. And if not, that link right there. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Good night, everybody.
Good night.